You develop fish keeping habits over the years, and sometimes they just aren't working for you or your fish anymore. Let's talk about some of my old habits that I've recently kicked, saving me time and lots of headaches. And the last one might even help you save the lives of your fish. Okay, this first one I still actually do with some of my tanks, but I've long since abandoned it with my other ones. And I'm talking about my more aggressive tanks. I no longer do this. And I think it's helped in kind of mitigating the crazy in them. You might have guessed this one already. We love to interact with our fish, don't we? And what's the best way we can interact with them? By feeding them, of course. But what's the one worst thing you can do with your fish? Overfeed them. So we're careful with how much we give them. Oftentimes, just cutting back the amount maybe from a few times a day to just once. And that's great for a lot of normal fish. But my fish aren't normal. They're cichlids, and there's a pretty good chance you have cichlids too if you're watching this. Well, a long time ago, someone left a comment on one of my African cichlid aggression videos telling me they feed them twice per day, and it's helped them reduce aggression. They're not doubling the amount of food they're getting, but splitting it up into two different feedings, once in the morning, once at night. So I'm still not overfeeding them, which can make your fish unhealthy, increase nitrates, and cloud up your water. So I decided to try it. And I've been doing this for about a year or maybe more, and as far as I can tell, it does work to some degree. Takes the edge off. They're like,
"You know, I was going to kill you today, my fellow inmate, but now I've had the breakfast of champions, and I think I'll just get you tomorrow."
So for my less aggressive fish, I still generally feed them once per day, but when it comes to my psychos, I've ditched the single feeding per day rule to help keep peace. This might help settle the aggression down in your tanks too, if you're having a problem with it. It's at least worth a try. If you watch Ben Ochard, he's been talking about this one for years. You always want to wash your filter media in tank water, right? To keep it from killing all the beneficial bacteria. Well, actually, if you've been watching him, then you know that he doesn't do that all the time, and neither do I. And I'll tell you why. I used to clean my filters differently than I do now. I'd clean them way too often. I wanted them to be completely clean on the inside, so even if there was a little grime in them, I just want to clean that off real quick. But the thing is, that brown sludge you see in your filter media is actually a good thing. It enlarges the amount of surface area, and that means that more beneficial bacteria can reside there. More is generally better, so I decided to clean my filters less often. Let them sit for a while and build up that sludge. Not so much that my filtration slows down and my gallons per hour goes down excessively. I can always tell when it's been too long between cleanings because my filters start blowing out micro bubbles. They're horrible. That means I've waited way too long. So I give the filters a bit more time between cleanings than I used to. It's actually working against you if you clean them too often. But here's another habit I dropped regarding my filters. I used to clean the media in tank water every time. I'd panic if I even thought about using tap water. Just in case you don't know, the chlorine in tap water is going to be death to your beneficial bacteria, so I'd stay away from it at all costs. But if you have a seasoned tank, it's been around for a while with lots of fish in it, then you might be stressing out about nothing. I've recently, this is within the last year, started just rinsing my filter media out right there in the sink. And this is because my tanks have been established for months or even years, and the beneficial bacteria is everywhere in my tank, except the water column. It's on every surface in the tank, and if you have more than one filter like I typically do, then it's in the other filters as well. So if I lose some bacteria from my filter media, my tanks are going to be all right. I haven't lost any fish yet because of it. No ill effects at all. Again, this is for well-seasoned tanks, not brand new ones. Oh, and one caveat. Don't do excessive cleaning in your tanks all at once. If you have multiple filters, then do one now and then wait a few weeks before you do another one. Don't want to push it and lose too much bacteria all at once, and then that will be a problem. And don't do gravel vacs the same time you clean a filter either. Give yourself a little vacation from it. Hey, you deserve some time off anyway, good fish keeper.
Subscribe or someone dies. Ding ding.
If you're a cichlid keeper, then I'm 100% sure that you've watched countless videos on how to decrease cichlid aggression. I mean, I have for sure. And I used to be a lot more hopeful that the fish would change their behaviors if I took some action. But lately, I don't have a lot of faith that these fish are going to change, and I'm a lot less forgiving than I used to be. I've tried this so many times with my more high-intensity psycho inmates over the 4 years I've had cichlid tanks. Grab a fish, put him in another tank in a small penalty box for a few days to help him forget that he's an a-hole. But does he forget? Well, it's kind of like solitary confinement for human inmates. It sucks, but once they're out, it's not like they've been reformed and they have a new, charismatic, shiny new personality. For me, they have always gone back to being a jerk, never fixed anything. Except for this one time, and this didn't work either, but it failed in the opposite way that it usually does. The fish I put in solitary confinement was a German red peacock. Everybody hated this guy because he was so mean. I kept him in a penalty box for several days and put him back in Alcatraz with 2 or 3 other new inmates. He became such a wuss in timeout though that all he did was flee from his attackers, and they wouldn't let up on him either. He never had a chance to become a jerk again. I took him out the next morning and I tried this twice with the same results each time. The last time I just wound up rehoming him to a great local fish keeper. So now if they're becoming dangerously aggressive, I'm not a gracious and merciful warden to that fish. But I am gracious and merciful to everyone else in the tank. I get him out and rehome him, skipping solitary confinement completely. Never works for me. Does it work for you? Let me know in the comments. There are some other tricks that I have used to reduce aggression though, and they have pretty much worked out pretty well. So check out the video in the upper right if you'd like to know more about that. Exciting times. You just got some new fish and you're gonna add them to your new tank, but first, since you're a good fish keeper, you're gonna quarantine them, right? You have a quarantine tank all set up, put them in there for a while before you stick them in the main tank. But how long do you keep them in that quarantine tank? Well, recently I've changed how long I'm keeping mine in quarantine before I move them over. Most of my life, I never quarantined a single fish because I was just ignorant. I was a bad fish keeper. I also wasn't a complete fish nut job like I am now either, always watching fish tubers, all my time consumed by my fish, needing a new project to work on all the time. That all started once I got into cichlids. So I've learned a lot in the last 4 years. Cichlids are amazing, and they'll eventually take over every waking thought if you're not careful. Once I started my first cichlid tank, that's when I started realizing that you need to quarantine. And one of the guys I watched on YouTube always said that you should keep them in quarantine for 4 weeks, but he was always too impatient and just added them after 2 weeks to the main tank. So that's what I did. You're supposed to keep them in quarantine just in case you don't know, just in case they have a disease, and then you won't spread it to your other fish, putting them in danger. Then you have an outbreak in your tank and you have to treat the big tank instead of the small one, which costs more money, and you could lose 1 or more of your current fish to a disease that they didn't have to be exposed to. So here's the thing about cutting that period short a few weeks and not being patient. Some illnesses won't present themselves until almost 4 weeks. They could look completely fine after a few weeks in a quarantine tank and then break out with a horrible disease on the end of week 3. So for me, it's just not worth the risk. I always do the full 4 weeks now. I'm a changed man, and my fish are all the better for it. It can take a lot of time and work to keep your tanks clean, especially if you're doing huge water changes on bigger tanks. Like I do 80% water changes on Alcatraz over here. Well, I mean, I used to. This one wasn't entirely my idea. I've had so many viewers comment on my videos telling me that 80% water changes is way too much to do. But my nitrates were high after a week, so what was I to do? So I decided not to take your advice. I kept doing huge water changes, even after I killed almost all my fish when I forgot to put dechlorinator in one time. Hey, it can happen to anyone. Terrible experience. But all I did differently after that was I created a checklist to make sure I added dechlorinator, turned back on my filters, wave makers, etc. However, if I'd done less of a water change when I forgot to add that dechlorinator, I probably would have had more time to react once the effects of the chlorine started happening. It wouldn't have been as immediate, and I wouldn't have lost as many fish. So that didn't even change my behavior, but this did. I recently made a refresh video explaining a pH phenomenon I noticed. I explained that I was checking my American tanks to see what the pH was in them, and I noticed it was really high, like 8.3, and there was nothing in the tanks to raise the pH. But I checked my tap ages ago and it was around 7.4, so I figured maybe it changed. I checked the tap again and it was only 7.6. So it rises after a day or so, by a lot. If you want to know why the variance in pH happens after a short time like that, watch my video in the upper right. So even though I haven't noticed any ill effects in my tanks when replacing huge amounts of high pH water with large amounts of low pH water, I figure it can't be good for them. Fluctuations are really hard on your fish and it can kill them. And maybe 24 hours isn't long enough to take them out immediately, but over time, a few years of this every week, that could take its toll on these guys and cause them to die prematurely. I don't know this for sure, but it makes sense to me. Just like smoking a cigarette isn't going to kill you, but smoke them for 25 years and it might. So now I just do at the most 50% water changes. I might have to add an additional water change midweek for some of my tanks if the nitrates are still high, but the extra work is worth it for me. All right, let me know if you'd like to know about more habits that I've kicked to the curb as a fish keeper, but until next time, that's going to be a wrap.